can we become more intimate with our experience than we are in our day-to-day conditioned lives? That's a question I often ask. You know, many just stay kind of trapped on the horizontal dimension, unable to somehow escape that horizontal momentum, because in order to do that you have to face yourself, you have to meet yourself in some kind of way. And I know that, you know, that doesn't really, you know, happen for everybody, so, you know, they get stuck, I guess, you know. But what's happened for me is the walls around the heart, the belief systems have unraveled. You know, over the years there's been such a great softening, I would say, and deepening and maturing, that I realized I, you know, was never really very intimate with my experience. Meditation sort of tried to give that to me a little bit, but it was always a struggle, and struggle and intimacy, you know, they don't fit together. They're not good friends. They're not intimate lovers. Struggle and intimacy are not lovers in that sense. And so I think persistence and softening and maturing and just, you know, keeping on being willing to surrender whatever is kind of standing in the way is not a phrase I like to use, but somehow keeping on softening. You know, there's such great power in softening. You know, we don't really talk about that. We're all busy talking about enlightenment and getting rid of the self and breaking through, and, you know, they're not, I'm not saying they're aggressive, but they're very much actions, we think, you know, that are going to further us on the spiritual path. And so they tend to be very yang. We're very yang orientated. We're, you know, we're taking action. We're you know, being active in our spirituality, and we don't really consider too much the power of what could be called yin, you know, which is softening, which is tenderness, which is intimacy. You know, surrender is vital on the spiritual path. You know, we don't tend to value those very much, but you know, from my own experience, I can see that, you know, softening has actually been almost fundamental. Did I arrive at softening, or did I soften and then arrive somewhere? You know, I'm not talking about arriving at enlightenment. I'm just talking about arriving at equanimity and a certain grace, if you like, a certain tenderness that makes the meeting of this individuation with what we could call the external world of experience a much more harmonious, a much more integrated relationship. So there isn't so much friction as the self sort of seems to rub up against experience, you know, as the nature of the rigid self, as it meets the apparent experience, the experience of the phenomenal world, you know, in its day-to-day movement that can be really quite abrasive. Yeah, it butts up against the self that chooses, the self that likes this, the self that doesn't like that, the self that is kind of, you know, trying to uphold its sense of itself, if you like. So it has a sort of, you know, the subtle energy body reactivity is still alive, and you know, some of the inherent unconscious belief systems are still running the individuation running the show, and that can make for a, you know, a sort of hit and miss experience with life. You know, it's a hit when it's good, and it's a miss when it's bad. You know, and that kind of creates suffering both for the individual, the individuation, and of course, you know, then ipso facto for the world somehow. And what I've noticed over the years is that that's all changed. There's a much more kind of equanimous relationship with experience that happens, and so what I'm saying, you know, to you is, don't doubt the power of softening, of knowing that softening, you know, is a beautiful way of experiencing openness. You know, softening the heart, softening the willful mind, softening the body system, finding out where, you know, that softening isn't happening. Finding out where kindness is not happening. And why not? Why not? What is being held on to that is still this? What is being held on to that is still saying, no, I won't let go of this. No, I won't let go of that. I can't let go of this. I can't let go of that. There's been too much insult. There are too many grievances. And just to be available, there's no answer coming here to any of that, but to be available for the potential that softening around some of that armoring, some of that rigidity might be, you know, beneficial, and might be more possible than you imagine. There is so much more possible for us than we imagine, but we somehow want to feel safe before we open, before we become tender, before we practice kindness to ourselves. But and so this video, in a way, is an invitation to be conscious about that, because that whole journey that I'm talking about kind of fosters such a deeper intimacy with our life. And when that intimacy with our life, and by life I just mean experience, the experience that we have as we move around the world, kind of slows everything down to the extent that we can become more conscious as we're moving around. It's the end of the sort of robotic state, because that's what happens, that's what we're trained for. That's what I was talking about at the beginning, this horizontal kind of momentum that we get trapped in, that we get locked in. Is almost a semi-unconscious robotic state. Well, you don't want that. Nobody wants that, really. But in order to do that, you have to become intimate with your life. You have to become intimate with your experience. And the only way to do that is to become consciously aware of where it's not happening, and to bring it in, and to bring it in, and to bring it in, and to say, yes, this too, yes, this too. It's profound, but it brings us into this presence, into this softer kind of presence, where actually we realize, wow, I'm awake. I'm awake. It's very normal, it's very natural, it's very intimate in a beautiful way. It doesn't have to be all like, wow, you know, it's just got an inherent truth in it, and an inherent beauty in it, because this intimacy with one's life, with one's experience, is by its very nature beautiful.